Thanks for joining our presentation today on climate adaptation in small and rural communities using regional approaches to build capacity. My name is Lauren Retheray. I'm the coordinator of the Columbia Basin Rural Development Institute and also a researcher.
My name is Jamie Jones. I'm also a researcher with the Columbia Basin Rural Development Institute.
The Columbia Basin Rural Development Institute is a social innovation applied research center located at Selkirk College in the West Kootenay region of British Columbia, Canada, or BC. So we'll talk today about our experience working as a convener for regional climate adaptation initiatives that bring together stakeholders from across our service area in Southeast British Columbia. And that's roughly known as the Canadian Columbia Basin or the Kootenays.
So in our presentation, we'll review the role of local governments in climate action in our region and review challenges to rural adaptation from our viewpoint. We'll also look at the Rural Climate Adaptation and Capacity Building project that we facilitated, looking at the details of that regional approach, both the benefits and the challenges and the key takeaways.
So our project involved working with local governments from across the region. In British Columbia, local governments include municipalities and regional districts, which govern rural areas. We chose to work with local governments because of the direct role they have in preparing our communities to adapt to climate change. So in Canada, local governments have jurisdiction over lands and deliver services that are very clearly affected by climate change. Things like providing drinking water, emergency services like emergency operation centers that activate in acute community level emergencies, snow clearing, regional parks, that type of thing. So this picture is the boundary region of BC, more specifically the nearby community of Grand Forks, which was hit by a record-breaking flood in 2018. It was the regional district that coordinated the emergency response effort, which involved a host of players from multiple agencies and jurisdictions. The other reason we chose to work with local governments is that they are well positioned to take action on climate adaptation. So climate change is a global challenge, and mitigation or greenhouse gas emissions reductions is something that we tend to think of on a global scale. But the impacts of climate change are more immediately felt at the local scale. Sticking with the flooding example, if we think about preparing our communities for more frequent and intense flooding, it is the local government that will lead that effort. And that certainly applies in the case of the boundary region, where the regional district is managing efforts to protect their communities against the possibilities of future flooding. And that includes, in this circumstance, relocating a portion of a neighborhood to make way for flood-resilient green infrastructure. These are some of the issues that make climate change adaptation a unique challenge in the small communities and rural regions that we work with. In short, rural areas tend to have lower levels of capacity than more populated areas. And of course, capacity comes in many forms. Lower levels of economic activity mean that there's often a shortage of available funds to undertake adaptation. Many employers in our region, including local governments, sometimes struggle to recruit or retain the highly skilled workforce that's needed to tackle complex adaptation challenges. There are fewer organizations that are dedicated to climate change or climate adaptation that are located within rural areas or even servicing rural areas. So for example, we don't have a university in our region. We see relationships among organizations and sectors as another key form of capacity. And because of our rural geography, with communities being very spread out, there's a tendency to look inward and work with what we've got, instead of looking further afield to strike new relationships and bring in fresh ideas. And then information or data, which is another critical form of capacity. Rural areas across Canada suffer from a lack of access to quality environmental data to drive informed decisions on how to adapt. And that's illustrated by this map of all the snowfall monitoring stations in British Columbia with at least 30 years of data. You can see that the area in the light blue circle, which is where British Columbia's major cities are, Vancouver and Victoria, have lots of monitoring stations, even though it doesn't really even snow there. Our region, which is the purple circle, has far fewer despite having a very snowy climate. So there's also some challenges that are specific to local governments. Rural communities have far fewer residents, and so their tax base is much smaller. They're often not able to fund those large scale or really innovative or risky initiatives. The local governments themselves are also small organizations. So some have just a couple staff that are tasked with delivering all the services a local government is responsible for. So understandably, it's difficult for them to prioritize preparation for future threats when they're max just getting water into people's homes or ensuring the lights stay on at the fire hall. So a common approach to capacity challenges is to join forces to achieve economies of scale. And in that way, our small communities can achieve more than they would if they had just acted individually.
So this moves us on to our Rural Climate Adaptation and Capacity Building project. We worked with 9 local governments in the Columbia Basin boundary region of southeastern British Columbia, as seen on the maps here. And this included both electoral areas in rural regional districts as well as municipalities. And the rural electoral areas had a much larger geographic jurisdiction than the municipalities. So the scale and types of services provided varied. Population size in our partner communities, which reflects the reality in many rural regions, also varied significantly. They ranged from 20,000 in the city of Cranbrook to under 200 in the village of Silverton. And our project was funded by the Federation of Canadian Municipalities and the Government of Canada. So the project had 3 main objectives. The first was to identify local government climate vulnerabilities. The second was to enhance local government capacity specific to common adaptation themes and priority vulnerabilities. And the third was to enhance regional scale response to climate change. So for the first objective, we conducted research on state of climate adaptation within each local government. To do so, we examined 58 indicators in 5 different pathways: the water supply pathway, agriculture, flooding, wildfire, and extreme weather. And in those pathways, we explored 4 different types of indicators: climate change indicators, such as extremes and averages in temperature and precipitation; environmental impacts, such as groundwater level or air quality; community impact indicators looked at the number of interface fires, the size of interface fires, or the number of days under water restrictions; and adaptation actions were explored, looking at how local governments, to see if they'd done floodplain mapping or interface fuel treatment. And the findings across each of the local governments led us to learning about the common vulnerabilities across our region. And so through this research, we had some common findings. Emergency preparedness was a clear priority for local governments in our region, and that's in large part due to the risk of wildfires or floods. Through surveys, we learned that personal emergency preparedness is low, and all communities have untapped opportunities for water conservation. There is limited data available on source water, and a program called Fire Smart provided education and recognition to communities that was on the rise. And Fire Smart is a collection of resources and programs designed to empower the public to increase neighborhood resilience to wildfire. So our first step to enhance the local government capacity at the regional level was to provide a series of online training sessions. And these were provided by subject matter experts. They covered a variety of topics based on the common vulnerabilities and themes that were determined in the state of climate adaptation research. And topics were also selected with feedbacks based on priority needs and interest from our local government partners. And some topics included low carbon resilience, natural asset management, and climate risk and vulnerability assessments. Unfortunately, these sessions were not well attended. They took place at the start of COVID, and that's when virtual meeting burnout and lower capacity was just a reality, although we did get very good feedback on the content. So the sessions were recorded and shared, and we created knowledge briefs to share with other local governments. We also learned from the process. We got feedback from our partners, and we adapted our approach. And what we heard is that partners really wanted to be engaged with each other to strengthen relationships and learn from their peers. And so we developed monthly regional adaptation network meetings. And this created a space for partners to get to know each other better, to ask questions, and share lessons learned. This provided them with the opportunity to learn what each other were doing, provided opportunities to share information with that same regional context, and to learn where there's opportunities for collaboration. The regional approach also included funding to go towards some small projects, and the local governments helped us determine what these projects would look like, as well as experts advising us. And they were designed to have the benefit of the entire region in mind. So some project examples include natural asset management training, natural asset inventories, watershed modeling, and personal emergency preparedness. And the last part of our project's regional approach was hosting a virtual event, which we called Bridging Silos, Advancing Climate Adaptation and Low Carbon Resilience in Small Communities and Rural Regions. This was a very successful event. We had over 50 speakers, over 19 sessions, and 220 attendees from rural regions throughout British Columbia. Speakers included experts as well as representatives from local governments, as representatives from nonprofit organizations that were doing work on the ground. And the sessions were all designed to be very engaging. The goals of our event were to build and strengthen relationships. That's creating the opportunities to collaborate with others across organization and sectors, to learn from others. So that created opportunities for developing that collective knowledge with our peers, and then to learn from experts. That's creating the opportunity for shared learning of best practices within the context of small communities and the rural regions. And due to COVID, this was an entirely virtual event, which actually allowed us to have broad participation from rural communities that wouldn't have been able to attend otherwise. And these are just a couple quotes highlighting some feedback we got from our attendees.
So why did we choose to act regionally, and why do we think that that approach could work here? Well, we were inspired by successful examples from elsewhere. So one such example is a federal program called the Regional Adaptation Collaboratives, which for the BC region is led by the Fraser Basin Council. That program found that regional collaboratives accelerated adaptation progress and nurtured relationships that are essential to tackling long-term adaptation problems. But really, we didn't have to look far to think that this could work here. Our region has a strong history of collaborating on climate change and many other issues that are critical to well-being in our communities. And that was in no small part due to the presence of Columbia Basin Trust, which is a regional organization with a clear mandate to support the ideas and efforts of people in the Canadian Columbia Basin. The Trust recognized back in the early 2000s that climate change needed immediate action and Kootenay communities needed help. So it all started with a program called Carbon Neutral Kootenays, which helped local governments measure their greenhouse gas emissions and make a plan to become carbon neutral. Since that time, there have been many examples of collaborative region-wide climate action projects that involve Kootenay local governments, several of which the Rural Development Institute has played a role in. The other reason we knew that this could work here is that we had willing participants. The local governments were game. They knew that they have significant responsibilities when it comes to climate action, and they also know that they can't do it alone. So an offer of funding and outside support was welcomed. And these are some of the benefits that we found by choosing to work regionally. First, the decision to collaborate helped leverage substantial grant funds that were used to engage us, a neutral organization that could coordinate a regional effort. Through that funding, we were also able to generate and share higher quality climate data in order to support informed decisions. We were also able to bring in experts to provide advice, training, or contribute to projects. Undertaking that training or those projects as a group was really helpful in that a cohort formed of local folks who were now working from a similar knowledge base. And that's especially important when we're talking about climate change risks or adaptation priorities that cross borders. So for example, British Columbia has a lot of trees. Wildfire is a major threat in our region, and municipalities and regional districts alike need to work together to mitigate risk. Perhaps the most important benefits stem from the peer learning and network building that happened as a result of this project. And so, as Jamie already mentioned, our participants demanded better knowledge of what their neighbors were working on and stronger relationships with their peers at other local governments. So a climate change coordinator at one community wanted to be able to pick up the phone and talk to somebody in a similar role at another community. So we've been very deliberate about facilitating that network building process. So this picture is my home community, Nelson, where bigger storm sewer pipes are being installed to deal with more frequent and intense flooding caused by severe rain events. Nelson is one of the higher capacity communities in our region and is known for its innovative policies. And so having them participate in the project really helped raise the game of some of the lower capacity communities. But the opposite also applied. The lower capacity communities have shared important lessons about prioritizing and being as efficient as possible with scarce adaptation resources.
And so as we worked through this project, we also experienced some challenges. And these challenges were very similar to the challenges that we previously mentioned, although the degree of the challenge was much less. And so not surprisingly, the biggest challenge was capacity. And it comes in the form of time, human resources, and money. As a good example, one of our community staff only has, one of our communities only has staff of 1.5. Which means that the chief administrative officer is responsible for everything in the community. And it's hard for her to find the time to participate even when she wants to. And other higher capacity local governments have a position dedicated to climate change. However, even with that dedicated human resources, there are silos within the organization that make it challenging to work with other departments, as well as not enough time or financial resources to get the tasks done that really want to get done. And that's this intra-governmental silos as well. And diversity among our local governments, as Lauren talked about, it does provide a benefit, but it also is a challenge. And some local governments are much further ahead than others. So we need to be able to support local governments at various stages of their path to climate adaptation. And when developing project ideas, it's hard to find topics that appeal to all our local governments. As an example, around the topic of flooding, we have a community that's on a mountaintop that doesn't flood, and then you have another community that floods all the time. Also, the difference in scale between the regional districts, those electoral area boundaries, and the municipalities, and the different jurisdictional size and service types makes it challenging to appeal to both. An example is with the lens of natural asset management. For a municipality, that can mean looking at one stream, whereas for the electoral area, that could be looking at multiple watersheds. So some key takeaways from our experience supporting climate adaptation in our rural region. A regional body, such as us in the Rural Development Institute, is necessary to help coordinate and support local government collaboration. However, it also had its challenges because it wasn't led by the local government specifically. And so it doesn't get the same attention as a core service or a priority that's put forth by elected officials. Building relationships is very important. Learning from peers is preferred over experts. Although experts are still necessary as a contribution, you need to have both. And it was important to check in with partners and adapt as conditions and needs changed, which was especially evident with COVID. Virtual collaboration is necessary in the rural setting. It makes it easy and accessible for all to participate. However, due to the challenges of limited capacity and competing priorities from our local government staff, it also makes it easier to just not attend an online meeting. And lastly, it's very helpful to have a climate champion within each local government. Doesn't have to have a specific job title, that doesn't really matter. What does matter is that they prioritize climate change and they're able to bridge silos within their organization. So thank you very much for your time.